So, Mr. Prime Minister, it seemed in 1997 that with your election and with the earlier election of Bill Clinton that the third wave politics that you're so identified with had found the formula for success for the ages, a modernized center-right political economic agenda along with a moderate center-left social agenda. It looked like the end of history in a lot of different ways. You and President Clinton were dominant political forces of your time, scrambling the right. And now, in the present, your party's under the grips of a radical socialist in Jerry, and until recently anyway, institutionally agnostic about Brexit, if not cheering it on. Whereas in the United States, Bernie, Democratic Socialist, not even a member of the party, but now a dominant player. And in 2016, he nearly beat Bill Clinton's wife for the nomination of the party. So looking back, how did it all fall apart? How did... There were a lot of successes, but it seemed to be less, these successes seemed to be less stable than they certainly appeared at the time. So what went wrong?
You know, I think what has changed. Thank you. Switch the mic on. Do I have to give the whole speech again now? Is that? You heard that, did you? You heard the speech, right? Okay.
Read the speech, the Russians, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, right. What went wrong? You see, the curious thing is, I mean, obviously you can say, you know, the financial crisis, post 9/11 policy and all of that, and but, you know, I often say to people in Britain when they say, well, how come now this centrist politics has been rejected? And I say it's actually not on offer. I mean, David Cameron, by the way, I mean, this is the extraordinary thing. David Cameron fought an election in 2015 in a centrist position from the Conservative Party and won an outright majority. Then the referendum, of course, has changed British politics completely. I mean, we won 3 general election victories from the centre-left position, and I believe if we carried on offering that position, we would have probably carried on, well, if not, obviously all governments get put out of power at a certain place, but at least we'd be much more competitive than we are today. So I think what's happened is there's objective factors, economic stagnation for a part of the population, a real feeling that the world is changing beyond people's control, and I think you've got to address those. So the policies that I would have today would be very different from the policies back in 1997 or even 2007, but the approach is still, in my view, basically the correct approach.
So before we move to the policies that we might want to consider for the president, I'm wondering if there are any policies from the past that were part of the bundle of third way politics that you regret now. I mean, you mentioned that that populists manifest grievances, that these are often legitimately held grievances, they need to be addressed. Were there any instances during your term of leadership where you would have changed policies in retrospect, or where you have regrets for not having addressed some of the emergence of these grievances that now rampage across the political landscape?
No, it was all perfect. No, of course. But I think in domestic policy, I mean, obviously in foreign policy, post 9/11 and so on, that's a whole dimension of political debate, but it's not really what's the issue now in Britain. The two differences, or the differences between the two main parties, are really a kind of nationalistic right wing that thinks the answer to Britain's problems is Brexit, when Brexit is literally the answer to nothing. But it's become the vehicle in which people express their dissatisfaction across a range of issues. So if I was back in government today, I would have to deal with those issues coming at us from the right, in particular the immigration question. Now, I did face that. I fought my last election, actually, on immigration. The Conservative Party raised it then. And I had a set of policies to deal with how you controlled immigration while still arguing that immigration properly controlled was good for the country. And I just think it's all about how you... Look, politics at a certain level, okay, you play defense and offense. okay, at a certain level, you've got to better block off your opponent's charge against you by making sure that you take account of the concerns that people have, for example, on the issue of immigration, and then you're able to move on to the areas where you may be able to play attack. So if I was, as I say, back in politics today, I'd be dealing with immigration, I'd be dealing with those communities that feel left behind, but then I would be developing a policy agenda that really had this technological revolution at the heart of it, and across all the part of policy saying, how do we get policy solutions that are radical but sensible? And you can see this, it's like if you debate climate change today. I mean, it's obvious that we need some radical solutions, but they've got to be sensible. And what you find is that parts of the right will just ignore the issue, and parts of the left want solutions that aren't, frankly, realistic. Right? So what this requires is, I always say about centrism, to win it's got to be muscular. It's got to be strong enough to go out with a clear policy agenda, block off, as I say, the points of attack, and then move on to the points where you're strong and your opponents are weak. And part of it's got to be switching the conversation. You know, if the debate in Britain is all about immigration, you know, these guys will win. It's got to be broadened out from that. You've got to deal with the issue, but then broaden the debate out.
So let's talk about that for a minute. I think that while there is a great deal of talk about what went wrong during the third wave politics of the 1990s and 2000s, there's often forgotten what went right, at least as far as the politics are concerned. I mean, when you were elected in 1997, I believe the Labor Party set a record with 418 seats. You were able to politically succeed with an embrace of moderation, which in this country is often hand-waved, as I'm sure elsewhere, as kind of phlegmatic, unprincipled, sort of a milquetoast, sort of offend the fewest people possible, but you were able to marshal it not only in an intellectually compelling way, but also in a politically powerful way. So where have moderates gone wrong before and after, and what was the secret that you understood about selling a muscular, vigorous moderation that is so often elusive to politicians who likewise try that game?
Well, I think we're in danger of becoming guardians of the status quo and not change makers. And this is an era in which people want change. So, look, you know, my government was the first Labour government to win 3 consecutive full terms, first Labour government to win 2 consecutive full terms. In fact, we governed for twice as long as the previous Labour government. And I remember realizing what our problem was. The day after I was elected leader of the Labour Party in 1994, I went to a meeting of all the party activists, and someone got up and said to me, because, you know, we've been out of power for 18 years, and someone said to me, look, Tony, the British people have now voted against us 4 times in a row. What on earth is wrong with them? And that was when I realized, you know, this is going to be a big challenge. But, you know, the thing is, what I would say for you, how we manage to make change. Okay, so let me give you 2 very specific examples, because I think this is where moderation as a concept is important. So for 100 years, Labour have been campaigning for a minimum wage. And for 100 years, we hadn't succeeded. And the Conservatives were hugely opposed to the minimum wage. The 1992 election was a big part of their platform against us. It's going to wreck business, it's going to make us uncompetitive, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So we had the policy commitment to introduce a minimum wage. But I wanted to introduce it in a way that made business feel comfortable with it. So we set up a low-pay commission. We put business as well as trade unions on it. And out of that evolved a proposal for the minimum wage, the way it was to be introduced, the way it was to be done. And today in British politics, no one would stand for election saying that we're going to get rid of the minimum wage. Or another example around, for example, gay rights. Okay. So back in the 80s, the Conservatives used to fight and win elections in opposition to all this stuff. And, you know, we constructed a dialogue where we just dealt with the arguments on it and did so in a way where, you know, people who found it difficult, we didn't regard them as people that needed a finger jabbed in their chest and, you know, why aren't you, more liberal-minded? We try to bring people with us. And I think so really what I'm saying, Jerry, is that I don't think that basic way of approaching things has failed. I just think it's not on offer at the moment. What definitely would change, of course, is the context in which you're applying it, because today you've got these major challenges and you have to deal with them probably by much more radical policy prescriptions than you would have, back then. So back then, in respect of climate change, for example, you might have had some quite moderate prescriptions. Today, I think, and I know this is a debate here in the US, you might be able to get support for a carbon tax kind of approach, which I think a few years back people would have said, oh my God, no, this is going to wreck the economy. So I think it's all about the context, but that approach of trying to bring people with you, if I was a Democrat in the US at the moment, the first question I'd ask is, well, why did they vote for Trump? I try and get my head around that. And I don't mean the people who stand up at rallies and shout daft things and all of that. I mean, what meant, people who, should have been prepared to come with the Democrats didn't.
So let me ask you about that. In this country, there's a lot of debate about whether the Trump vote came from economic anguish in rural America, trade disruption, a technological change which has been misunderstood as a manifestation of trade disruption, or whether they were racially motivated voters, whether racial resentment explains a lot of this. And for those who've made the economic argument for the Trump vote, they usually run aground when we look at populist insurgencies in Europe where the economic dislocation did not play out, but the populist insurgency did, largely around resentment with regards to immigration and Islam and sociocultural issues that are cousins of the racial resentment arguments that played out here in 2016. So if you're asking the question, where did this vote come from, and then how do we talk to those voters? Were you a moderate politician today, given these, given these tensions? How would you think about it?
Well, one thing I've discovered in America in the last couple of years is it's quite hard to have a rational discussion about President Trump, so I won't attempt it. But I think, because the same phenomenon is all over Europe, you see, there are people who are worried about immigration who are prejudiced. But not all people worried about immigration are prejudiced, right? So that's what in my view, you will have. It's like I say to people about Brexit, if you want to deal with Brexit, you've got to deal with the underlying issues. Now, for 35 or 40% of the population, they're going to be in favor of Brexit whatever happens, for whatever reason, and I don't fully appreciate all elements of it, but that's their thing. But the question is, how did they get the next 12%? Right? And there you've got to deal with the underlying questions. So if you're in Europe at the moment, and this is where I think the debate has shifted enormously in Europe, and why actually there is a huge opportunity if there was a strong centrist set of policymakers in Britain today to say Britain will think again and Europe should think again. Because actually the issues that underlay Brexit in Britain are European-wide issues. They're not just restricted to the Brits. I mean, we had the referendum, right? But you could have had this anywhere in Europe and had a similar type of result. So if you're talking about Italian politics at the moment, without dealing with the immigration question, forget it. You're not going to get a hearing. So this is where I think you've got to go to, and it's our task to provide reasonable solutions to these things. So again, if you've got immigration coming from majority Muslim countries, there is an anxiety in parts of our community back home as to whether people who come in share our values, are the security issues that come with it. You've got to confront those honestly. It doesn't mean to say you say there's a big problem with the Muslim community. It means you do have to say there is a real issue of anxiety and we've got to make sure we deal with it and deal with it in a way that actually protects the cultural integration of the country and does not end up in a situation where people feel that they're threatened, either within the Muslim community or from outside it. You see what I mean? So it's an attitude of mind. And that's what's lacking at the moment, I think. There's the absence of creativity around how we do our politics, which allows us to deal with issues in a sensible and evidence-based way and seeks to kind of build bridges between people who disagree with each other.
I'll have one more question, then I'll open it up to the audience. When you talk about evidence-based public policy, that reminds me that while it's important for us to be able to deal at the granular level with regards to a policy agenda that is compelling and addresses the concerns of voters in a courageous fashion, for moderates at at a more elevated level, the concern is that for those who are either identified with the third wave politics of the 1990s or 2000s, or their heirs today, even though the set of answers and policies would be far different because the contingencies are different. But there is a conflation between moderation and globalism, which is on its heels right now. Even though we might not call it globalism, we might call it moderation in an open society, which is likewise on its heels right now for many of the same reasons. And with technocracy, the technocratic elites, which populists feel have let the country down and that they have erred and made mistakes, not only in the financial crisis and the Iraq War and in various other circumstances in the United States going all the way back to the Vietnam War. And so when you talk about moderation and evidence-based policy, for a lot of voters in the United States, and I think probably elsewhere, what they're hearing is Davos, technocratic elites, and globalism. And that's about the hardest brand to sell in American politics, or probably Western politics today. Now, on the other hand, Emmanuel Macron won with a forthright defense of all of these matters, so maybe he knows some way of selling that agenda that have escaped us elsewhere. But I'm curious, do you think that the identification of moderation with globalism, technocratic elitism, and all of that is fair? And how would you suggest wrestling with that when this is, if I had to choose things to go campaign on, this would not be my top 5 choices right now?
Yeah, but you see, this is where we've got to be much stronger in defense of what we're doing. I mean, the whole point about globalization is that it's a fact. And by the way, it's not a policy of government. It's driven by people and technology and migration and travel. And this is, the way the world is going to open up. And has it been of benefit to the world? Of course. I mean, why has China lifted more people out of poverty than any other country in human history? Because it opened up. Right? If it hadn't opened up, it wouldn't be where it is today. Likewise, what was the beginning of India getting on its feet economically? The reforms made in the early 90s, which opened the economy up. How are these two countries going to get to the next level of development? By opening up and reforming still further. So it's not globalization that's the problem. It's making it work for, as we say in the title for our institute, it's making it work for the many, not the few. It's how you, in a fast-changing world, how do you empower people, protect them, help them, to make sense of that change? That's why I think this technological revolution is so important. It doesn't really form part of the political debate, at least in my country. And the one person who is using it, by the way, in political debate is Macron. And the fact is, it's going to change everything. It's going to change healthcare and education and the way we work. It can change law and order. I had a policy presentation given to me on defense from people from the US a few weeks back. It was all about technology. So this is going to change the world. So how do we make sense of it? And we've got to go out there and explain to people. Of course, we've got to deal with these other issues, but explain to people, here is something as powerful as the 19th century industrial revolution that's going to happen to us. And these guys, one part thinks that business, hammering business is the answer, and the other guys think that hammering immigrants is the answer. It's not the answer to either of these two things. Yes, there are problems with the way business operates. Deal with them. Yes, there are problems with immigration. Deal with them. But then focus on what is going to be the big challenge of the future. And you always win in politics when you're able to give people a sense of how you can make the future work for them. And that's also, that's essential to recreating optimism. Look, everyone, I always say this to people who want to be political leaders. You've got to be optimistic. I mean, look, if you get on an aeroplane, the last thing you want to see is a depressed pilot. Right? You get on the plane, you want to see the guy, you're looking at the pilot, you think, I want that guy to have something to live for, so if you want to get people in that frame of mind, you've got to go out and explain the world to them, you've got to say how it's changing, and you can deal with their issues, but you can deal with them without then slipping into either a situation where you disrespect their anxieties, which is parts of what certainly the left do around things like immigration. Oh, you can't raise issues around immigration because people are anxious about it, you've got to deal with it. Or on the right, they just kind of this sort of ideological blinkers that come down. And, you know, if you want to deal with the populism, it's dealing with it in the way I described, partly by dealing with the grievances, but then getting on to the conversation about the future, where actually these populists don't really have anything to say.
Before we go to, just one last thing, you talked about how in politics you must be able to project a degree of optimism, and I think that's excellent advice, particularly for moderates. But to be fair, I know you don't want to talk about Donald Trump, but it's about the least optimistic man I've ever seen on a political stage. He is always angry. He is always upset. He is always marshaling grievances. I don't think I've ever seen him smile unless somebody had taken a horrible fall in front of him or something where you got to mock the person. I mean, this is not a man who sells optimism. This is a man who sells darkness and who sells strife and struggle and conflict, and has done it very well. I mean, I'm sure there's an asymmetry involved here where moderates can't do that sort of thing, but if you would have told me in 2015 a candidate who looked like that would be able to win a general election in the United States, I would have said, no way.
Yeah, well, you're obviously not very keen on him, but it's, see, I don't, look, I mean, my advice is to focus on what we should be doing right. I mean, I think it's really important when institutions come under attack that you defend them very strongly. That's why I don't think moderation means passivity. But it's like, you know, I feel in my own political situation today in Britain, because it's very similar, and when I speak to European politicians, it's the same thing. You can go on about all the iniquities of the person you're fighting, but in the end, the starting point of an effective fight back is to chart the right strategy to win. And, you know, my point is, it's a good idea to win. Because if you don't win, you just... And part of the trouble, for example, with the Labour Party in the UK at the moment is it's become a party that's a protest movement. But, you know, protest movements and governments have it's a different thing. You know, I always say to people, if you want to go into government, you've got to recognize you're not the person who's going to be holding the placard outside the building. You're going to be the person whose face is on the placard with a great cross. That's the difference between government and protest. So my thing is, you know, make the protests against what you think President Trump is doing wrong and so on and so forth. But if I was in the Democrats today, I'd be thinking all the time about how I can get the right winning strategy that's going to pull some of those people that voted for President Trump over towards me, and that's going to give the country a sense that there's just a different way and a better way of moving forward. But if you get mired in a kind of trench warfare battle, I think it's, because he's pretty good at that. Yeah. So I would do it differently.
We'll now allow you to ask a few questions. Wait for me to call on you, and if you're so lucky that I do call on you, identify who you are and try not to give speeches, but to ask questions unless it's a pretty darn good speech. I'm going to start with Avik or Roy, and wait for the microphone, please.
Thanks. My name is Ovik Roy. I'm the president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a think tank in Austin, Texas. Thanks for being here. You mentioned both in the context of Brexit and other populist movements that there are legitimate grievances that moderates have to address. Other than just acknowledging the pain, feeling the pain, what are some of the objective economic data or criteria you see in Britain or elsewhere that you feel that moderates of both parties need to do a better job of addressing in terms of economic policy?
Yeah, so I think with the economy, that I've fitted into three categories. First of all, what is the right macroeconomic position? And, you know, in the UK, we developed a politics around austerity that, in the end, I think put too deep a squeeze on people. That's a very powerful counter case to be made. But I always say to people, if you want to be more expansive in your macro policy, you've got to make sure that you have the business community well on side. In other words, if you start sending signals that you're going to be having an expansionary macro policy, you need to make sure that you're protecting yourself against the argument that you're going to spend money and not use it properly. So this is why an expansionary macro policy with strong public service reform and pro-business, pro-enterprise policy is one that works. I don't think it works otherwise. Secondly, I would be addressing this whole question of digitization of industry, because it's going to be a huge thing that's going to make an enormous difference. And thirdly, I think education's got to come out of the box it's in at the moment and become an economic imperative for a modern nation. And at the moment, I don't know about here, but back home, although we did make significant strides in education when we were in office, I think that the necessity of high-quality education throughout life, and that's from early years right the way through, is now a bigger priority today than it would have been back then. Actually, it's a central priority. So I think, I would be arguing for a set of policies that allow the economy to grow, that empower people and help them, support them through this process of change. And then one final thing is, I think there are communities that have very specific issues where they have been left behind by globalization. Communities that have lost stable industries, those that feel completely marginalized. I think you need special measures to deal with those. You need to go in, and you shouldn't be apologetic about it. You should go in and actually help those communities, work out a proper policy of industrial renaissance for them, and so on. And I think it's perfectly easy to do that. So, those are the types of things I would be looking at if I was back in making policy today.
One of the reasons I asked you about whether there were any policies that were part of your agenda that you have regrets over, or that you thought you might want to have discussed more, if you could rewind the clock. I remember talking to somebody from the Obama administration a year or two ago, and they're actually, no, it was the Clinton administration. They found their job in the Obama administration later. And their point was that we knew that globalization and free trade would be a tremendous boon to the United States economy. We also knew there would be trade disruption in local communities, and we downplayed that. We should have done more. We found Republican opposition to doing as much as we would have liked, and in response to it, we sort of hand-waved it and dismissed it as a significant policy concern, and we're now riding the tiger because of that.
Yeah, so you've got to adapt as policy changes. I mean, just to answer one point, by the way, on immigration, I'm not in favor of just feeling the pain. So there are three things that have to happen. One, we need a proper system. I would have a system of electronic identity in the UK, because actually our biggest problem is people being in the UK who are there illegally. Secondly, I think freedom of movement within Europe is a good principle, but it's been used in certain circumstances to undercut wages. And there's actually now a strong desire in Europe to address that problem. And thirdly, we need to secure the external borders of Europe. Because even though Britain's not part of the European system of migration, once people are in Europe, they can come to the UK. So, no, I think we've got to, empathizing is not enough. You've got to have policy to deal with it. All I'm saying is that in the end, you're not going to win an election with a better immigration policy in the UK from the Labour Party side. But you can prevent yourself losing on that basis by having that. You're going to win when you paint a different picture of the future.
Next question. You're in the front.
Kevin Moss from the World Resources Institute. Thank you very much for all your remarks. On climate, you said it's obvious we need radical solutions, but they must be sensible. If sensible means not stupid, there's obviously a lot of common ground, but sensible is also often used to stop us pursuing radical solutions. Certainly we've seen a lot of US trade associations use that. Can you talk a little bit more about the balance between radical and sensible?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good point. I mean, I think ultimately the solution on climate change will be in the development of the science and technology. Okay. And what I'm in favor of is anything that incentivizes the acceleration of that and that gives people strong incentives to diminish their carbon footprint. So you can have a range of different policies around that. I think they should be as radical as the political market will bear. And you've got to make a judgment. I mean, if you're in practical politics, make a judgment about that. But I think you're able to do things of a more radical nature today than you were before. But you might decide, for example, that you were going to take quite radical action on carbon, but use some of, if it raises taxes, for example, to help lower income families as a counterweight to the difficulties they may have if the cost of fuel goes up. So, look, this is always a balancing act, but I think you can get to a more radical position today than before. I think if we really went all in on the development of some of the technology, it would be much easier to do. Now, I personally think, but this is unpopular in certain quarters, in fact, quite a lot of quarters, I think nuclear power has got to be part of the mix, I would say. But, that's an area where, if you like, a moderate may say, no, if you look at the evidence, it really should be part of the mix. But other people will challenge that from quite an ideological position on it. So, these are the difficult questions of politics, but I think if you frame it as radical but sensible, provided you're prepared to be truly radical, I think it's a better way of framing it than just making a sort of claim that you're going to be able to transform the economy overnight, which I think most people will find not credible.
Mona?
I'm Mona Charan from the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in D.C. One aspect of this populist, nationalist movement is that there's a reevaluation in this country about America's role in the world, and specifically about our role in NATO in Europe. What would be your response to the argument that is heard widely on the right now, including from the president, that our commitment to Europe was completely one-sided and that we got nothing from it and it was pure give and no take? And how do you see a world that will have less and less American leadership, specifically about NATO?
So I would say, explain to people why in the world that's changing, where the rise of China is the single biggest geopolitical factor in my children's lifetime. I mean, I think we still don't really understand the full implications of this. But it's of enormous significance. And then, you've got a resurgent Russian nationalism at the same time. The transatlantic alliance is an absolutely essential part of protecting our way of life, our values and our security. And, the president's not wrong, by the way, to say that the Europeans should spend more on defense, but it should be done within the framework of a solid understanding of why NATO matters, why it's important to our security, and why engagement with the world is enlightened self-interest. I mean, that's the most important thing to explain to people. I mean, I had a pretty staggering thing the other day that was said to me by someone, I won't say who because it was a private meeting, but very well placed to give a commentary on Syria. And they said, because there were a whole lot of Europeans and indeed Americans around the table, and they said, America doesn't really count, Europe doesn't really count, this will be decided by Russia and Iran. Okay, that's fine. If we want to take the view that we want to be out of that equation, I understand all the reasons for that, having gone through post 9/11 world, but is it sensible for the West? No. If we're not engaged with the world, then our ability to affect things that ultimately will come to our own shores is constrained. So I think we just got to make these arguments and make people understand that in the end, this is an argument I have with people on the right here in politics. Some people say to me they're pro-Brexit and they think that Brexit is then going to trigger a whole lot of exits across the European Union. And I say to them, number one, that is the myth that has sustained these Brexiteers for the last 30 years. It's never happened. It isn't going to happen. No one else is leaving Europe. Right now, the British are leaving Europe. Actually, other countries are still lining up to join. So the first thing is, it isn't going to happen. The second thing is, if you break up the European Union, China will just pick individual countries off. I mean, the world that's developing, you're going to have three giants. This is the way I look at the world today. Three giants. You're going to have America, you're going to have China, and probably India. And then you're going to have some tall countries. But these tall countries are much smaller than the giants. Mexico, Indonesia, Brazil, are larger population countries, a couple of 100 million people. Japan, obviously, Those will be important, but the gap between the 3 top economies and the number 4 is going to be large, right? And then you've got medium-sized countries like Britain, France, Germany, Italy. Right? If we don't stick together, this is why the European Union matters today. If we don't stick together, we're going to get flattened by the giants. Now, I would like us to be at the top table, along with the country that shares our values and way of life most clearly, which is the United States of America, encouraging India to develop as a strong democracy, and hoping in the time that we can reach an accommodation with the rise of China that's peaceful. But I sure as hell know we are more likely to get a peaceful accommodation with China if we are strong in the West than if we're weak. So this is the argument. We've got to go out and make it to people. And this sort of isolationism, by the way, which is echoed on the left. I mean, the interesting thing is where the right and the left meet each other. It's contrary to our self-interest. So it's not that, I don't say let's be part of NATO because I want to be nice to other countries. I don't say Britain should be part of the European Union because I've got some love of Europe above Britain. I say it because it's in the British national interest to be part of Europe. It's in Britain's interest to be in NATO. It's in America's interest to have that strong NATO alliance. It's what we've got to argue with people. And, actually, in the end, this is the opportunity for the Democrats. If they were arguing that in a strong way, they would actually get traction because there must be people who are traditional Republican voters who support that analysis.
One last question before we wind up events. Is that Arnold Kleen back there with his hand up?
Yeah, you made it sound. Sorry. So you made it sound as though third-wave politics could really be articulated successfully, but it's not. So is the problem that the current politicians are incompetent, or is there any structural reason why third-wave politics doesn't have strong support now?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's amazing how wise you get after you leave office. I say this with complete humility because I know what it's like to be in government. It's extremely difficult. Everything I am saying is what I passionately believe, but I also know it's quite hard to do. But why is it? Well, I think there is a different atmosphere in political debate that's brought about around by social media. I know it may sound slightly obsessive to say this, but I do think it's a revolutionary phenomenon. And I think politics hasn't yet understood how to grapple with having a political debate when social media pretty much is a exchange of headlines and often, frankly, an exchange of abuse rather than argument. I think that's one, the context is different. But I think the issue is that you've got a situation where, for the reasons that Jerry was giving, sensible politics, moderation, came to have a kind of bad name, in a way. And in an era where people want change, okay, if you think my circumstances, I'm not sure that my children are going to do better than me, and I want that changed. Someone who comes along and says, look, you know what? These people have been temporizing and fiddling and, compromising, but I'm going to turn the whole system over. It's a very powerful message. One of the things I notice in today's politics is that in that era of sort of social media and heightened political debate, the moderate guys, they kind of get buffeted. They get blown around. And the curious paradox of it is at the same time as you have people sort of trying to push politicians into positions, funnily enough, the politician who says, here's where I stand, I don't care what anyone says, I'm just going to do it, actually it gets traction. So this is why I say that the centrism, if it's to revive, is going to be quite muscular. I mean, one of the things I find really weird, except when I started to analyze and talk to people about it, is why in parts of European politics, including Britain, President Putin and his style of politics has admirers, left and right. And I came to the conclusion in the end it's because he didn't care what anyone thinks, he just does what he does. So we don't want to emulate that, but today's conventional politicians, are in a defensive crouch. And that's why they're getting overridden by the other guys. So it's like, one of the things that used to really irritate me in office is when people would say to you, you should listen to the people. And I'd say, you know what, I'm listening to them. But it's a curious thing, because they're saying different things to me. So asking me to listen to them doesn't really help me. So some people are in favor of them and some people are against it. So my job is to make decisions. Now, you can like them or you not like them. Now, that, from the moderate part of politics, has gone right out of fashion. I had a European leader say to me the other day, I think I'm going to have to shift policy on this. I've had 100,000 people on Twitter or whatever it was. And I said to him, look, is that 100,000 representing 10 million? Is that 100,000 representing 1 million? Is that 100,000 representing about 101,000? You've got to know, because otherwise you're going to be making policy.
Are they bots from St. Petersburg?
Right, exactly. Who knows? So I think the conventional politicians haven't yet learned how to work in this new world. But the one thing I'm absolutely certain of is that what we're describing today, beyond left and right and reviving moderation, it doesn't work unless you get leadership that is strong, prepared to listen but prepared to lead at the same time. And that's really what we've got to do. We've got to get out there. We've got to deconstruct the arguments of our opponents. We've got to set out a new policy agenda. We've got to mobilize people. We've got to get organized. I mean, these left and right populists are well organized. They're linked together. They join hands together. All of the things you're discussing today, you could have this debate in any European country today and people will recognize exactly what you're talking about. So we've got to get busy and organized, because although I have said that I'm optimistic, and I never know whether this is just part of my nature or it's based on anything, any realistic analysis, but I am optimistic, but I do think if this populism carries on over a 10-year period, I think it could, in the end, fundamentally damage democracy. Because if you end up with two tribes of people who don't listen to each other, talk to each other, or even like each other, at some point, people say, you know what, they shouldn't be in government. It's not a question of who wins. They shouldn't be there. And if I win, they shouldn't come back. So that's when it gets dangerous. So we've got a big challenge in our hands. But, what we're saying, by the way, if we say it in the right way, and if we do it in the right way, we'll get the following and we'll win. But there's a strength that we need to exhibit, and an urgency, and a determination that has to arise pretty fast, in my view.
Well, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I completely agree with you. My own sense is that while moderation may not be in political or intellectual vogue right now, it is the necessary lubricant for a free and open society to keep us from tearing each other's throats out. And one of the reasons why, though the economy is strong and the nation by most objective metrics is in better shape than we might have imagined prior to the election of Donald Trump, the reality is that large numbers of Americans, absolute majorities, believe this country's on the wrong track. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is an absolute foreboding, I believe, on both sides of the aisle, even amongst those who are more ideological than, say, I am, that we are moving in a terribly dangerous direction where this country cannot live in a united sense. It is too divided, it is too divisive, it is too fierce, and it is one where the forces that are driving us apart will eventually lead into horrifically dangerous places, which I think leaves a pregnant opportunity for moderates to fill the breach. In other words, the worse this has become, the more likely I believe it has come for a moderate revanche, at least in the United States, or so I hope. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Do I leave? Yeah.
And thank you for joining us as well.
Sure.
Remember this guy?
Yeah, what's your name?
Oh, Allen, A-L-L-E-N. I must say, follow